But let's go deeper than this and take a more scientific approach to things. For what I'm about to illustrate to you can apply to a secular and biblical model for the origin of Semites. In terms of the biblical model, this would fit an old Earth that has to go back at least 100,000 years ago, give or take. With that being said, let's begin. First of all, when it comes to secular science, they also state that a scientific Adam and Eve would have been dark-skinned, similar to how Christians say the same thing.
Jefferson may look European, but his Y chromosome tells a different story. It shows that what we look like may not really tell us where we come from. And it raises a question mark over the traditional image of Adam. For centuries, artists have depicted him like this, like a European. For many of us, this is Adam. Michelangelo's famous painting in the Vatican's Sistine Chapel. He looks like a beautiful Italian who spends a lot of time in the gym. Did the common ancestor of all men really look like this? The story of Jefferson suggests he could have looked very different. Finally, Wells comes face to face with the man he's been searching for. A new portrait of the common ancestor of every man today. Adam. Without a skull, we can't know for sure what Adam looked like. But a combination of genetic evidence, Bender's forensic skills, and cutting-edge computer software suggest he looks something like this. Thousands of years after the Bible, and hundreds of years after Michelangelo, we have a whole new face for Adam.
I like the expression. He's got a very forceful look.
He's intent on something, maybe taking over the world. You begin to get perhaps an insight into why these guys won out and why this guy's our ancestor.
With that being said, if Adam and Eve and early humans are dark-skinned, we can ask the same question as last time. Did the early descendants of Shem remain dark-skinned like Adam and Eve and early man, or did their skin tone change? This brings us to the next important question and subject in terms of an old Earth. Who are the earliest descendants of Shem? Semites being a Middle Eastern and Afro-Asiatic population, they likely would descend from basal Eurasians. Basal Eurasians are ancient indigenous Middle Eastern populations. Basal Eurasians under haplogroup DE are the ancestors of Afro-Asiatic populations, including Semites. This is why haplogroup DE is the best choice for Shem. Basal Eurasians is an ethnic lineage which exists in greatest amount among ancient Near Eastern individuals. Basal Eurasians may have been present in the Near East as autonomically modern humans resided in the Levant approximately 100,000 years ago, and African-related tools in Arabia were likely developed by modern humans. Hence, they may have settled in the Levant or Arabia, the areas of the Near East where Basal Eurasians resided, may have been areas where contact with Neanderthals, who were known to have lived in Western Eurasia, were not made. According to the paper titled Origins of Modern Human Ancestry, it reads, "The origins of Basal Eurasian ancestry most likely centered around Southwest Asia and North Africa, and are unlikely to have connected to evidence of humans further away from Africa before 60 Ka. And according to the paper titled Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human migrations, it reads, "The highest level of Basal Eurasian lineage found in East Arab-Persian reinforced previous genetic and archaeological evidence of early human settlement in the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf. Thus, the exposed basin of the Arabo-Persian Gulf is a possible homeland of basal Eurasians. Frequency of Y DNA haplogroup E in modern populations and hypothetical migration route from its ancestor clade DE in Southwest Asia, Middle East. Haplogroup E arrived in Africa about 77,000 years ago and diversified in the Horn of Africa. It arrived together with specific West Eurasian alleles and later also diffused into various Paleo-African populations, as well as among the ancient North Africans, which were an population indigenous to Northern Africa and distinctly related or ancestral to modern West Eurasians. Haplogroup E and DE have an Middle Eastern origin. Haplogroup E migrated into Africa as part of the massive migration of basal Eurasians, ancestral West Eurasians, and then diffused and diversified within Africa, specifically the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa. Haplogroup DE next to CF, where the basal Eurasian lineages which expanded from the Middle East. The common ancestral lineage Y-DNA Adam is suggested to have originated somewhere in the Middle East or the Iranian Plateau. Massive Eurasian migration and following admixture created the many different African populations of today and are the reason for the high genetic diversity observed in sub-Saharan Africa. In other words, modern African people, sub-Saharan Africans, formed from indigenous Paleo-African groups and intrusive Afro-Sans, Afro-Asiatics, basal Eurasians, and ancient North Africans. Finally, there is the fact Y-DNA-E is dominated among non-hunter-gatherers in Africa, and it is within the Eurasian clade DE, while indigenous African hunter-gatherers belong to haplogroups A, A00, and B. So again, when it comes to my table of nations breakdown of haplogroups, Shem is haplogroup DE, or YAP positive. Ham is haplogroup A and B, which is Paleo-African, YAP negative. And Japheth is haplogroup CF, which is Eurasian. It's also YAP negative. With that being said, since basal Eurasians represent the ancestors of Afro-San or Afro-Asiatic populations, which Semites are an Afro-Asiatic population, what did the ancestors of Semites, basal Eurasians, look like? According to the paper titled Levantine Cranium from Menot Cave, Israel, foreshadows the first European modern humans. From this published Nature paper, it points to basal Eurasians resembling Africans or the Paleolithic Europeans. And it reads, it is similar in shape to recent African skulls, as well as to European skulls from the Upper Paleolithic period. Basal Eurasians likely looked like recent Africans or Upper Paleolithic Europeans. Let's look at Upper Paleolithic Europeans to understand how basal Eurasians looked. An artist by the name of Tom Bjorklund has made paintings of what Upper Paleolithic Europeans looked like. Let's take a look at the way he depicted them. If basal Eurasians look like recent Africans or Upper Paleolithic Europeans, then we are clearly looking at a population of people that would have looked dark-skinned, specifically dark brown to medium brown to light brown. And again, the reason why basal Eurasians are important to us is because basal Eurasians with haplogroup DE likely represent the earliest descendants of Shem after the flood if you go with an old Earth model, with the Earth being over 100,000 years old. Basal Eurasians with haplogroup DE are the ancestors of Proto-Afro-Asiatic populations. With that being said, let's move to a closer time period to the ancestors of Semites and see what they look like. All the best evidence points to Natufians as being the direct ancestors of Semitic populations. According to the book titled In Hot Pursuit of Language in Prehistory, it reads, "This paper makes an additional inference since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant." And according to Transition to Modernity by Cambridge, it reads, "Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Abilite and Akkadian early Semitic languages are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. With that being said, what did Natufians, the direct ancestors of Semites, look like? According to the book An Introduction to African Civilizations, it reads, "There is evidence that some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, a black Negroid race inhabited Palestine. Even Sir Arthur Keith agrees that they were clearly Negroid, distinctly prognathous, with wide faces, flat noses, and long, large heads." Sir Arthur Keith goes on to say that these early Palestinian blacks may have been the ancestors of the Semites or Arabs of biblical times. And according to the paper titled The Questionable Contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European Craniofacial Form, and it reads, "It is a further surprise that the Epi-Paleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa." Interestingly enough, however, the small Natufian sample falls between the Niger-Congo group and other samples used. This placement suggests that there may have been a sub-Saharan African element in the makeup of the Natufians. As shown in Figure 1, the Somalis, the Egyptian Bronze Age sample from Naquata, may also have a hint of a sub-Saharan African component. So here is Figure 3 from the paper, and it shows Niger-Congo and Natufian being very closely linked to each other, as well as prehistoric/recent Northeast Africa being very close as well. And again, this is dealing with craniofacial form. And here is Figure 4, again dealing with craniofacial form. Natufian sits in between Niger-Congo and prehistoric/recent Northeast Africa. Natufians are phenotypically within between those two groups. If the late Pleistocene Natufian sample from Israel is the source from which that Neolithic spread was derived, then there was clearly a sub-Saharan African element present of almost equal importance to the late prehistoric Eurasian element. In the past, old anthropologists described Natufians as being somewhat Negroid, and now in future studies they say Natufians look in between Sub-Saharan African or Niger-Congo and Northeast African. Here is a reconstruction of a Natufian, reconstruction of a Mesolithic Natufian man based on the Jericho skull excavated in Israel. Ancient DNA analysis of Natufian samples has revealed that they were ancestral to the Levantine Neolithic population, forebears of the contemporary Semitic-speaking groups of the Middle East. So again, Natufians are the ancestors of Semites, and Natufians are clearly a dark-skinned population with a robust bone structure and phenotype, likely somewhat resembling Niger-Congo populations and Northeast African populations. But with that being said, we can actually look much deeper at what Natufians may have looked like by looking at their closest ethnic cousins, the Ibero-Maurusians. Both the Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians are descendants of basal Eurasian populations. Both Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians carried haplogroup E. According to the paper titled Projecting Ancient Ancestry in Modern-Day Arabians and Iranians, a key role of the past exposed Arabo-Persian Gulf on human migrations, and reads, also, the ancient Ibero-Maurusians specimens could be in part descendants of basal Eurasians, as they have a shared genetic affinity with early Paleocene Near Easterners. Best proxy are the Natufians, and 1/3 of input from Sub-Saharan Africans, a mixture between West and East Africans. Thus, so far, Southwestern Asia is still the best probable homeland for the hypothetical basal Eurasian population. And according to Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveal core of West Eurasian ancestry, and it reads, our co-modeling of Epi-Paleolithic Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians from Turfalt confirms that the Turfalt population was mixed. But instead of specifying gene flow from the ancestors of Natufians into the ancestors of Turfalt as originally reported, we infer gene flow in the reverse direction into Natufians. The Neolithic population from Morocco, closely related to Turfalt, is also consistent with being descendant from the source of this gene flow and appears to have no admixture with the Levantine Neolithic. If our model is correct, Epi-Paleolithic Natufians trace part of their ancestry to North Africa, consistent with morphological and archaeological studies that indicate a spread of morphological features and artifacts from North Africa into the Near East. Such a scenario would also explain the presence of Y chromosome haplogroup E in the Natufians and Levantine farmers, a common link between the Levant and Africa. And according to Pleistocene North African genomes link Near Eastern and Sub-Saharan African human populations, it reads, the Turfalt individuals were found to be most closely related to populations of the Near East Natufians, with 1/3 of their ancestry from Sub-Saharan Africa. No evidence was found for integration with Western Europeans despite attribution to the Ibero-Maurusian culture. We present genomic data from 7 15,000-year-old modern humans attributed to the Ibero-Maurusian culture from Morocco. We find a genetic affinity with early Paleocene Near Easterners, best represented by Levantine Natufians, suggesting a pre-agricultural connection between Africa and the Near East. We do not find evidence for gene flow from Paleolithic Europeans to late Pleistocene North Africans. The Turfalt individuals derive 1/3 of their ancestry from Sub-Saharan Africans, best approximated by a admixture of genetic components preserved in present-day West and East Africans. Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians are basically cousins, and they share haplogroup E, and they both are descendants of basal Eurasians. With that being said, what did Ibero-Maurusians look like? Here is a reconstruction of a Ibero-Maurusian. According to the paper titled Lakeside Cemeteries in the Sahara, 5,000 Years of Paleocene Population and Environmental Change, and it reads, the older occupants have craniofacial dimensions that demonstrate similarities with mid-Paleocene occupants of the southern Sahara and late Pleistocene to early Paleocene inhabitants of the Maghreb. Principal components analysis of craniometric variables closely allies the early Paleocene occupants at Garabo with a skeletal robust trans-Saharan assemblage of late Pleistocene to mid-Holocene human populations from the Maghreb and southern Sahara. Their crania are long and low and are characterized by distinct occipital bun, flattened sagittal profile, pentagonal posterior outline, broad proportions across the zygoma and interpretal region, broad nasal aperture, and negligible alveolar prognathosism. Craniometric data from 7 human groups were subjected to principal components analysis, which allies the early Heliocene populations at Gobi with mid-Heliocene mactoids from Mali and Mauritania, and with late Pleistocene Ibero-Maurusians and early Heliocene Caspians from across the Maghreb. The striking similarity between these 7 human populations confirms previous suggestions regarding their affinity, and is particularly significant given their temporal range, late Pleistocene to mid-Holocene, and trans-Saharan geographic distribution across the Maghreb and the southern Sahara. So here is a forensic reconstruction of the Gobi people from the University of Chicago. And as we just read, the Gobi people would resemble Ibero-Maurusians, so this is yet another example as to how Ibero-Maurusians could have looked. And here is a forensic reconstruction of a Kefian, again from the University of Chicago. And Kefians and Gobi people and Ibero-Maurusians, they all would look similar to one another. So as we can see, Natufians and Ibero-Maurusians and Kefians all would have a similar look to each other. We're looking at a population of people that are dark-skinned with African features. So Natufians, the ancestors of Semites, would have been a dark brown-skinned population of people. It's actually no wonder why anthropologists state that Semites were African and that early West Asians looked African. According to the book Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, it reads, Greenberg determined that Semitic languages really form only one of 6 or more branches of a much larger language family, Afroasiatic. Even the Semitic subfamily itself is mainly African, 12 of its 19 surviving languages being confined to Ethiopia. This suggests that Afroasiatic languages arose in Africa and that only one branch of them spread to the Near East. Hence, it may have been Africa that gave birth to the languages spoken by the authors of the Old and New Testaments and the Quran, the moral pillars of Western civilization. And according to a conversation with Christopher Ehret, he says, after all, the early Semites were just a few Africans arriving to find a lot of other people already in the area. And according to comparison of craniofacial features of major human populations, early West Asians resemble Africans. And according to the paper titled The Questionable Contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European Cranioform, it reads, it is a further surprise that the Epipaleolithic Natufian of Israel, from whom the Neolithic realm was assumed to arise, has a clear link to sub-Saharan Africa. With that being said, however, most ancient human populations were dark-skinned 15,000 and 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. Even in Europe with Chatterman, he was black-skinned with black curly hair. He had blue eyes, but even Paleo-Europeans were dark-skinned over 8,000 years ago. And he had haplogroup I, which is common today among Germanic, Swedish, and Scandinavian Viking-type Nordic peoples. Here is an academic reconstruction of the remains of 2 Scandinavian SHG fishermen from Norway. Genomic analysis of samples JS1714 and JS136 show that they carried the traits of dark skin, eye correlation, and wavy hair. According to the article titled, First Modern Britons Had Dark to Black Skin, Chatterman DNA Analysis Reveals. And it reads, the first modern Britons who lived about 10,000 years ago had dark to black skin. A groundbreaking DNA analysis of Britons oldest complete skeleton has revealed. The fossil, known as Chatterman, was unearthed more than a century ago in Greg's Cave in Sumerit. Intense speculation has built up around Chatterman's origins and appearance because he lived shortly after the first settlers crossed from continental Europe to Britain at the end of the last ice age. People of white British ancestry alive today are descendants of this population. It was initially assumed that Chatterman had pale skin and fair hair, but his DNA paints a different picture, strongly suggesting he had blue eyes, a very dark brown to black complexion, and dark curly hair. The discovery shows that the genes for lighter skin became widespread in European populations far later than originally thought, and that skin color was not always a proxy for geographic origin in the way it is often seen to be today. And this is a map where Chatterman was found. Again, he was found in the British Isles, one of the first and earliest settlers of the ancient Britons, who had dark to black skin. The results point to a Middle Eastern origin for Chatterman, suggesting that his ancestors would have left Africa, moved into the Middle East, and later headed west into Europe, before eventually crossing the ancient land bridge called Doggerland, which connected Britain to continental Europe. Today, about 10% of white British ancestry can be linked to this ancient population. The team homed in on genes known to be linked to skin color, hair color, and texture and eye color. For skin tone, there are a handful of genetic variants linked to reduced pigmentation, including some that are very widespread in European populations today. However, Chatterman had ancestral versions of all these genes, strongly suggesting he would have had dark to black skin tone, but combined with blue eyes. Scientists believe that populations living in Europe became lighter skinned over time because pale skin absorbs more sunlight, which is required to produce enough vitamin D. The latest findings suggest pale skin may have emerged later, possibly when the advent of farming meant people were obtaining less vitamin D through dietary sources like oily fish. Chatterman's Y DNA belonged to an ancient sister branch of modern I2-L38. The I2A2 subclade is still extant in males of the modern British Isles and across other parts of Europe. And here is the reconstruction of Chatterman, and as we can see, he is dark or black skinned and his hair is black and curly, but he does have blue eyes. And he is an ancient Briton. Again, his body was found in the British Isles, and he would represent one of those ancient and earliest Briton populations. And he's also the ancestor of the modern British population as well. With that being said, all ancient human populations were dark or black skinned over 8,000 years ago. It doesn't really matter where you were on the planet, whether it's Europe with Chatterman, or Scandinavia, or even the Levant with the Natufians, or North Africa with the Ibero-Maurusians. All humans were very dark-skinned over 8,000 years ago. Therefore, by default, you can make the argument and say that the ancestors of Semitic populations would be dark to black skinned. White skin or light skin is fairly recent in terms of human history, only coming into existence about 8,000 to 7,000 years ago. According to the article titled How Europeans Evolved to Have White Skin, starting around 8,000 years ago. Europeans have not always been light-skinned, and Caucasians are in fact a fairly new development on the continent, relatively speaking. According to a new study reported in Science magazine, it has been found that Caucasians are the product of a patchwork of evolution in different places across Europe, while scientists have discovered 3 genes that produce light skin, both of which have played a part in the lightening of Europeans' skin color over the past 8,000 years. Since researchers began to sequence the genome of ancient populations last year, it has been discovered that Europeans today are the product of hunter-gatherers and farmers of at least 3 ancient populations having mixed together during their migration to the continent over the past 8,000 years. By comparing key parts of DNA across the genomes of 83 ancient humans from European archaeological sites with recent ones from the 1000 Genomes Project, Ian Mathinson of Harvard University Lab of Population and geneticist David Reich discovered the genes linked to skin pigmentation that had survived the natural selection process across Europe. With that being said, all humans were dark-skinned at some point, all of our ancestors. So by default, the ancestors of Semites were most definitely dark to black-skinned, whether you believe in an old Earth or young Earth. But now the question we have to ask ourselves is this: did early Semitic populations remain dark-skinned like their ancestors? Let's begin with the Natufians, since they are the closest ancestors to Proto-Semites. Natufians lived in the Levant during the Mesolithic and Neolithic, and they clearly looked African. Reconstruction of a Mesolithic Natufian man based on the Jericho skull excavated in Israel, ancient DNA analysis of Natufian samples has revealed that they were ancestral to the Levantine Neolithic population, forebears of the contemporary Semitic-speaking groups of the Middle East. So again, Natufians are located in the Levant, and they are the ancestors of Semites, and we have a clear description and depiction of them.